second. Let me stop. Ooh. Where's my timer? Come out. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. I will take POI in chat box, but after 5, if I haven't taken any POI, just turn on the mic and shout. I will take your POI. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, negotiation is not happening in the status quo where all the so-called objective reporting has been made by the Western journalists. It is not happening in the opposition's world, and the opposition's world bring us neither a solution or a trend of organic change that happening in the status quo that is going to bring any promise or hope to the Palestinian state to establish with. The reason why the negotiation will never happen in the opposition's world is simply because that the Israel government has absolutely no incentive to negotiate with Hamas because, first of all, the military power of the Israel government and the technology they have, such as the Iron Dome, Al-Khamish, Steps of Wisdom, bring them absolute advantage towards any harm of the military forces Hamas could bring to the Israel state. And number two, Israel's powerful international allies with great economical and political and military power support them, make them fearless toward whatever pressure could actually come from the Palestinian side. And that's the fundamental reason why that Israel will never even intend to find political solutions towards the direction of Palestinian state and peaceful progress. In my speech, I will talk about 2 things. Number 1, I will talk about then why the deprioritization will decrease the international support from the international societies, which is extremely important for this Israel's finance, economic, and military technologies by internal institutional change. And second, I will also explain why journalists is justified to make the deprioritization because the news is already very, very biased in the status quo. Before that, several replies to the opening oppositions. We think the opening opposition's responses for us is actually quite simple and naive. Basically, they're saying that we actually have very objective report now, and that objective report will somehow improve the progress of the peaceful talk, and somehow the analysis of Hamas is very, very important for people to understand them. Pay attention that from the government side, we never say that from our side of the world, there will be a lack of analysis of Hamas. It is simply of a change of angle how we perceive them. For example, from our side, we can still analyze the suffering of Hamas, things that, for example, like the past half a centuries, will analysis then it is exactly because the Israel government has pushed so much in the military and human rights violations to the Palestinians. That's the reason why that the Palestinian state and Hamas is totally justified to fight back in the name of self-defense. All this process could still bring the Western world and the Western societies to understand the suffering of Hamas, to understand the motives behind Hamas without actually prioritize Hamas' role on the escalation of conflict. So still we can report conflict, mutual violence, but we're actually not going to emphasize it's Hamas' fault. Even if you can access videos online, alternatives in our world, you still get the liberal journalists explain this conflict, arbitrate to Israel government because of their oppressions, etc., etc. And I will encounter with the objective report later on in my second constructive. So first of all, how we're actually going to cut off, or not cut off, but try to decrease the international support from the Western societies, and why this is extremely important in this debate. Because the reason why we see that Israel is strong in the status quo and they do not have strong incentive to start a negotiation with the Hamas is because the ally behind them. The reason and the process we are going to decrease the intention of the ally is actually to use the influence of the journalism and use the influence of exposures on the medias, try to change the view of the Western voters and make the voters to use their vote to vote for candidates and policies that is in favor of the Palestinian people. For example, in the Biden government, we probably want for the United States, they could probably increase the people's intention to vote for the Biden-Harris government and push forward the Biden government to decrease its, for example, like financial cut, financial support to the Israel government, to decrease the trade on weapons, to decrease the tax support to the Israel government, etc., etc. This is extremely important because, for example, just like my partner has explained, actually the Iron Dome system is the reason why that the academic arena has criticized the Israel state. One of the fundamental reasons why that they're in lack of political solutions to seek to peace, because now the missile defense system is able to block like 96% of all the so-called missile attack from Hamas. So there's actually no way for the Hamas to hurt the Israel people and Israel government or extremely limited harm. Well, Israel have all the means to fight back. For example, they have invented their artificial intelligence, like war machine system like Alchemist, Gospel, and Depth of Wisdom. This also support domestically their Western wing parties, for example, the major of like Shaurya, to support and push forward the political force within the Israel government to fight back and eliminate the Hamas even further. But number two, what will explain that why we actually have the justifications. Before that, I will take PO. I'm from CEO.
What exactly do you think Hamas does in its everyday operations to Palestinian civilians?
Okay, this is very interesting. I will talk about justification on the second constructive. This touched my argument very nicely. First of all, I want to argue that the report in the status quo is already biased. That's the reason why we have to deprioritize the responsibility of Hamas. First of all, we already have seen that there is already an echo chamber existing in the Western societies because the readers, they have certain stereotypes towards Hamas, and because their news agencies are always like profit driven, give them sufficient motivations to depict Hamas in very negative way. But even if let's take opposition's best case, that they can so-called like fairly and objectively report the news, we have already seen that Israel has natural advantage. Number one, we briefly think that Israel has like basically better PR strategies department. They have more finance to hire consulting firms such as Spain and PR firms such as BCW, who understand the ideology and mentality of Western voters the best to help them to create their image. Number two, inherently the news journalists like can find better news and better like images from the Hamas because there are more violent images and radical comments. But the reason why they have more violent comments is exactly because the only way they can fight back to Israel soldiers is to rocks to the soldiers, while Israel has so-called like civilized the way to eliminate Israeli forces. For all these reasons, we are so proud to propose.
The recording up again. Yeah. So member of government.
Yeah, just confirming that I'm audible.
Yep, all good.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll be taking POI through voice probably at around the 5th minute. So, and preferably from opening. All right. I will start in 3, 2, 1. I think O's right in one thing. This debate's not really about liberal media that's reporting things. I think if you're a journalist within liberal media, you can probably have things like corporate overlords. You probably have things like corporate incentives that probably control the things that you kind of report. So you don't really have a lot of freedom to choose and not to choose what to report. I think the debate truly lies when you're talking about individual journalists who are probably working independently and don't have a large amount of credibility. Because the top half discussion about solving the structural conflict is really unlikely to happen because this is about a small set of journalists journalists who are probably changing their style of reporting to one particular extent. So it's about the small impact that these journalists can have. It's about the incentives of that journalist, and it's about mechanizing why those ideas work. Two broad things in extension then. First, we'll talk about why you should particularly not talk about Hamas and why the things that Hamas does should definitely not be reported in specific to the body itself and not just general atrocities. Secondly, what are the incentives of journalists? Before that, a few extraneous responses. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that negotiations are likely to fail, which Ower says. I want to note here that this is something that's completely symmetric. Note the fact that Western countries like the US and even Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been signing deals with countries like Israel because of the fact that Israel is a country that's extremely powerful. Also note the fact that Israeli leaders like Netanyahu or Bennett are going to be nationalists and hardliners on either side of the house, so they're really not going to get any sort of delta there. But secondly, I want you to note the fact that Palestinians themselves are unlikely to negotiate within these circumstances because there is usually a large amount of despise, the hatred that they have for the movement because of the failure and persecution by the Israelis, means that any sort of negotiation is not likely to succeed from either side of the house. If you have negotiations, you are likely to get results like the Camp David Accords, which meant that individual Arab countries signing deals with Israel for their own benefit and ignoring like this country altogether. Secondly, note at the top of the speech, the fact is that the reason that you can't just do things like graphics and you can't do things like show the bad things that Israel is doing is because of the fact that Hamas is also carrying out attacks. Right? It's because of the fact that Hamas is also carrying out bombings to some extent. So the reason is that what you have to do on our side of the house is you have to emphasize on the humanitarian aspects of Israeli attacks. Talk about the fact that 66 children died due to the Israeli bombing of Gaza. Talk about all of these important things. This is really important because of the fact that the death of individuals that you get, it talks about things from a position of asymmetry and leaves a visceral imprint in the minds of people, which means the fact that they can use this impression and they can use this lingering impact in order to read more about the movement and then feel a large amount of sympathy from the movement. That's why necessarily you must do exclusively only this motion. The alternative, where there's both sides doing atrocities, people don't really have that sort of emotional viscerality for the side of Palestinian cause. Therefore, that's completely out. I want to know what the characterization of this debate is like before going into our extension, because I want to note today the problem is not that the Palestinian movement is not famous, i.e. people don't know about the movement. It is the fact that very few people give positive attention to the movement. Very few people care about the movement, and that's uniquely because of the fact that Hamas's activities are quite negative and reported quite negatively. This is for a number of reasons. First is the fact that there is corruption and mismanagement within Palestine, and reports of this lead to individuals not supporting the cause because they feel like the movement can't be trusted. Secondly, is because of the fact that Hamas's actions to a large extent as well lead to things like violence and death, and when people from outside actually look at these kinds of movements, they're likely to be dissuaded from supporting the Palestinian cause. But thirdly, this is not about media houses in the West and like Israeli PR firms that are doing this. It's about blocks of Jews who live in Western countries, i.e. the Jewish Congress in the UK and the United States, who are generally the kinds of individuals who are able to then get media narratives out into the country, into the West, and therefore, because of the fact that they just have a larger amount of presence within the political system there, are able to control media narratives. On to our first extension then. Who are the individuals that actually listen to this, right? Because I want to know that this is not like staunch Zionists or anti-Palestinians, because these individuals who are like anti-Palestine are not going to listen to Palestinian journalists at any rate because they don't really like to listen to all of these things. Secondly, it's not likely to be staunch pro-Palestinians affected by this motion either, because these individuals will support any group associated with Palestine, irrespective of the results that happen. Thirdly, it's not likely to be state leaders either, because state leaders don't want to be seen aligning with things like terrorism, which I'll talk to you about a bit later. So who are the people who are actually impacted by this? These individuals are moderates. They have a number of things about them. First, they are aware of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, but they're also aware of the fact that Hamas has carried out attacks within Israeli occupied territory. The fundamental thing about these people is the fact that they know both sides have committed atrocities and they are unable to decide on which side they should actually support. The reason that they decide in favor of Israel is because firstly, the fact that the Israel generally has a more powerful PR bloc, so the images of Hamas attacks can become more visceral. Secondly, is the fact that Israel has connection to Western countries, so it can utilize its prominence in the international sphere to get its narrative out. But third, and this is the most important thing and why Hamas is most important, is because they talk about Hamas and they label the attackers from Hamas as terrorists, and they talk about the global impact of things like terrorism. Individuals are likely to buy into this idea to an extremely large extent because of the fact that terrorism is something that has impacted people to a huge extent in the Western world. I want to talk about why this motion then changes it. Note the fact that the idea of terrorism has been important in people's minds to a large extent for four structural reasons. First is the fact that there has been violence by Islamic groups over several parts of the country. Note the fact that, trigger warning, there was recent beheading of over a cartoon of the Prophet. Secondly, know the fact there have been lone wolf attacks in countries in the West. For example, the accident that happened in Germany, where there was attacks that have been carried out by Islamists in the West. Thirdly, know the fact that right-wing narratives exist in all parts of the world that demonize immigrants in Europe, who effectively mostly tend to come from countries in the Middle East. These individuals have their very culture and their very identity attacked, which is then disseminated through a large area because of the media. Fourthly, know the fact that even the government narratives support this to a large extent, i.e. things like Switzerland banning the burqa, France calling for things like freedom of speech over the rights of Muslim people to talk about the Prophet. All of this means that structurally, you have a large number of people who are scared of the impacts of terrorism, because terrorism has had a huge impact on their life. It is a large national security issue, and every single major stakeholder cares about it. Uniquely because of this motion, when you downplay this idea, what you get is the fact that individuals who view news from such journalists are likely to accept it. What is the impact for this? And this is the actual mechanization. A large number of people then get aware of the movement. Know the fact that journalists are also likely to get more amount of personal credibility because of what I noted at the top of this speech, which means that this personal viewership can then be used to a large extent to spread news about the Palestinian cause and get to know about the movement to a large extent. In the longer term, this means that you can get public pressure, can focus on the humanitarian aspects, and then finally get some sort of peace, some sort of ceasefire, and some sort of deal, as you saw with the Oslo Accords. It cannot happen in the short term. It cannot happen because Joe Biden is liberal. It's because in the long term, people's minds are going to change because of the fact that you don't strike the fear of terrorism into them. Finally, then, who are the journalists and what are their incentives? I want to know the fact that the journalist's incentive is not to be objective in all cases. This journalist is partisan and supports the Palestinian cause. They know the fact that the Palestinian state is a far cry and they want to support it to any large extent. This is not only about journalists within the West, but it's also about journalists within the Arab world. Individuals who live in the Arab world, for instance, don't want to downplay the Hamas because their own life and work might be a threat as well. Because if they start going against the Hamas to some extent, they might lose their life and they might lose their livelihood and they won't be able to support the movement. For all these reasons, so proud to propose.
Thank you, Member of Government, for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome the Member of Opposition. Here.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yep.
Okay. As before and throughout this tournament, I can only take POIs if you unmute yourself and say point of information, because I cannot look at the chat. I will be looking at my timer. Okay. I would prefer one from OG, and if not, then CG. All right. For my speech, just a disclaimer, none of these are my personal opinions. This is a debate. This is a case. It's not me. Okay. So starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. 2014, 2010, Hamas shot rockets at Israel and Hamas shot rockets at Palestinian authorities. The fact of the matter is that for the past few decades, Hamas has been escalating conflicts in a way that uniquely harms Palestinians. Hamas needs to be stopped, its support needs to be cut at the core, and Palestinian journalists are the best actors to do this. A few points of framing first. First of all, changing Israeli actions, what type of political incentives they have, the defense decisions that they take, is very unlikely to happen. Because first of all, their civilians are being bombed already. And second of all, the Israeli right is going to absolutely push the idea of Hamas being responsible. It does not change on either side of this. Israelis are going to read Israeli news more than Palestinian news, and that news will 100% blame Hamas for the escalation, because like I'm going to prove to you, they are very much responsible. Second of all, changing international actions is also extremely unlikely. This is because even the progressives that CG talks about that read Palestinian journalists also read the Washington Post or the BBC. This means that they're very likely to know that Hamas is responsible for this escalation. We also think that even if they didn't, who cares? They're people in the world. They have very little power. It's much more likely that the incentives of international actors are based on literally just what the US wants and what Israel wants. US and Israel are always like the minority of General Assembly votes, literally 2 out of like 173. The occupation is still going on. International outrage is meaningless. And we think that to a large extent, international actors like human rights organizations and the UN will always condemn Hamas because, like I said, it is shooting rockets at civilians. So this debate is mostly about the people that are almost always ignored in debates about Palestine, Palestinians, and what their views are of different organizations within their authorities, because this is the people who are going to be most affected by Palestinian journalists. So the first thing I'm going to do is prove to you that Hamas is absolutely responsible for escalating the conflict. And this means that principally, journalists should criticize it if they believe in a state. 4 reasons why they have stopped the progress of a Palestinian state. First of all, they've moved conflict into a military confrontation instead of a civilian confrontation. This does two things. First of all, it leads to more missiles, weapons, and military attacks from both sides, which means people die on both sides. What does this mean? First of all, it means diplomatic negotiations are literally stopped. Any progress by civilian authorities on stopping those evictions from Sheikh Jarrah are literally thrown out the window when people start getting bombed in the country. Second of all, it creates huge jingoistic fervor in Israel for harming Palestinians for justifying defense activities. Because again, civilians are being bombed, their homes are being destroyed, and thus the defense of the state requires defense, right? Like this is the narrative Israel is going to push. Second of all, this also means there's a rise in anti-Arab rhetoric from right-wing groups talking about how Palestinians are shooting us in our homes. This means that the political incentives for Israel are like irrevocably destroyed because you've shot rockets at them. Third of all, you store weapons and mortar in civilian housing within Palestine. And this is something that has been like a precedent of Hamas, right? Like in the past, we found rockets in schools and hospitals that Hamas stored there. This is bad because it justifies the Israeli narrative that all Palestinian civilians want to kill them, and thus again stops any effect of negotiations from civilian authorities. But fourth of all, this also means that the civilian authorities within their negotiations constantly have to justify terrorist actions within their places and have constantly to face these face threats saying, unless you stop these terrorist actions, we won't negotiate with you. The Palestinian state is harmed because of these actions, and thus journalists should criticize them. But second of all, the practical benefits of this and the practical harms. What exactly happens on side government? Deprioritizing Hamas leads to an increased level of support for Hamas in three ways. First of all, Palestinians are effectively told that the worst actors in the region should be supported out of solidarity in times of crisis, right? This makes Hamas looks like a member of the United Palestinian Front, right? And legitimizes them as like brothers and allies with misguided methods, but honorable aims because they're ignored in the critical aspect of like discourse. And second of all, this means that emotional frustration that occurs during wars will need to be directed somewhere. When it's not directed at the people that escalated it, it's probably going to be directed at Israel, which is normal, right? Obviously, that is going to be changing on, that's not going to be changing on either side of this. But because it's not directed at Hamas, it's likely to be used for recruitment by Hamas. People are going to join that organization and join them with storing those weapons in like participating in the political assassinations they commit internally within settlements within like West Bank and Gaza. And third of all, during times of war, when journalists silently show support for Hamas, it's likely that people will cooperate with Hamas, even if they don't join it, and look away from actions that they take, right? Why is this bad? Because of a lot of reasons I'll give you in a second. But first, let me give you the benefits. And then before that, I'll take a POI, hopefully OG, if not CUG.
Right, OG. Hamas has a lot of local support in Gaza, and they even won an election a couple of years ago. Why is your report, because they give medicine food to local people, why is it your reporting will stop Hamas and conducive to any statehood? What is the mechanism?
Okay, so why is Hamas going to lose support? I'll tell you in a second. And second of all, why Hamas is it's a good thing Hamas will lose support. Three reasons Hamas will lose support if journalists do this, and they're the best actors to do this. First of all, journalists are seen as figures of respect and authority within these communities. They often look like role models and voices of reason for civilians, right? When they directly criticize Hamas, people are more likely to actively oppose them. Second of all, journalists making these statements defines the narrative that politicians push. For the past few decades, the Palestinian Authority has had huge issues with Hamas because they stopped them from properly negotiating. They literally assassinate members of the Palestinian Authority over differences. If the negotiations they're going in don't have the radical concessions that Hamas wants, they kill people within the Palestinian Authority. This means that they want to say, screw Hamas, why did you do this? But they can't, because there needs to be a solidarity that comes when journalists ignore Hamas's role in escalating the conflict. When journalists set the precedent that the media is also criticizing Hamas, politicians can continue to push this as well. But third of all, this literally attributes responsibility for these problems to the right person and makes it almost impossible to join Hamas because of the social ostracization that comes from this. This is an important deterrent mechanism that occurs during a time of conflict that is necessary to stop escalation of this conflict and more Palestinians dying, involving themselves in a bloody, violent war that is literally a terrorist action because it is harming civilians. Three reasons why Hamas is a bad actor, and even if CG comes and tries to push this, right? First of all, Hamas literally carries out huge levels of militant actions within Palestinian settlements against political rivals. This does two things. First of all, it just disrupts everyday life and creates insecurity and instability within Palestinian settlements. This stops anyone from investing in the area or having basic economic growth in their everyday lives, right? But second of all, because it does actions against its political rivals, the collateral damage often kills civilians as well. We think that stopping the recruitment of Hamas as well as the political power of Hamas is the most important thing in this debate, and Palestinian journalists should stop this. This is the most likely benefit to occur in this entire debate, because Israel isn't going to stop bombing Palestine at this point, and neither is the international community change based on Palestinian journalists and their narratives. We think this is the most likely case that's going to occur. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Member of Opposition, for that speech. And I'd like to welcome Government Whip. Here.
Right. Am I audible and visible?
Yep, both.
Okay.
Thank you, Government Whip, for that speech. To end the debate overall, I welcome Opposition Whip. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things I'm going to do in my debate. First of all, I'm going to outframe CG and tell you why they take the L. Then I'm going to tell you about then I'm going to engage with OG, and then finally make a comparative between us and our opening. I think first of all, CG's most important clash is that, what about international actors? What about international viewers of the Palestinian conflict? I think international viewers of the Palestinian conflict don't have any necessary impact in this debate for 2 basic reasons. I think the lack of association and the lack of affirmative action that comes from these international viewers is so limited in its own extent that they can't have that level of impact on Palestinian people. What does this look like? This looks like that we don't care that if an American person thinks that Palestinian people don't deserve that kind of liberation. We don't care if an American person does not supports or does not support Hamas, because at the end of the day, the impact that American citizen has, the direct impact that American citizen has in terms of the affirmative action that is going to take place within Palestine is really constricted in its own nature. Given the fact that the only solution as of right now is a creation of a Palestinian state through referendum, I think the strongest actors that you have as of right now is Palestinian people. I think on that particular moment in time, you necessarily have to disincentivize individuals to opt into Hamas. Primarily due to the fact that they're in its own essence exploitative in nature of these people, but also primarily due to the fact this hurts cause of other movements like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, like other international organizations that actually work for Palestinian liberation in a non-violent way. Notice they don't engage with this extension of Shaurya about non-violent movement and movements in PLOs itself. But also, right, given the fact, if I agree with CG that international actors have some level of influence in this debate, I think we're still better. How do I flip this? I think given the fact that as of right now, you think of the Israeli conflict as an Israel versus Hamas conflict over the Israel versus Palestine conflict, this looks like us now recognizing that Hamas itself actually does shit ton of atrocities on the Palestinian people. This looks like us telling you that Israel is bad, maybe Israel is bad, like Hamas is bad, but the person who is the victim as of right now is the Palestinian people themselves, which means that all of those centrists, all of those people who actually opt into an anti-Palestinian rhetoric, primarily due to the fact they see Hamas as the face of Palestinian people, are far more likely to now opt in our side of the house, primarily due to the fact that we actually prove to you how at the end of the day, Hamas is someone that actually causes atrocities. Hamas isn't like the main representatives of Palestinians. Palestinian people are the victims in this case. So if international individuals have so much of an impact on this debate, I think we are still better off on that impact. Given then, I think Palestinian supporters do not support Hamas because they respect Israelis as well. They're liberal and thus can be influenced by narratives about anti-Semitism and basic human rights. They're liberal, so they literally hate violent conflict. Secondly, Palestinian supporters don't fucking matter because US and Israel literally have an international veto within the Palestinian conflict. Secondly, I think on the government side, Hamas is literally told that if they escalate the conflict, they will get more political support and people will stop criticizing them. Understand, civilian actors in Palestine hate Hamas, but they stop criticizing them during wartime. Primarily due to the fact they feel that the only sense of closure that they will have is through Hamas. So when you actively go silent on Hamas, not only do you actually incentivize Hamas to basically carry out with its atrocities within hush circles. Like so this looks like Shaurya's example of like Hamas using Palestinian hospitals, Palestinian orphanages to actually store its weapons. But also at the end of the day, do you actually incentivize Hamas to then escalate the conflict? Thirdly, I think Palestinian journalists do hold respect in Palestine. What kind of fucking like I think Palestinian journalists do hold respect in Palestine. I think CG talks about that Palestinian journalists are likely to lose on social capital primarily due to the fact that they think that they're a sellout. I think on international community, Palestinian individuals are now likely to be seen as a sellout, which is primarily due to the fact that they aren't objective anymore. Primarily due to the fact that as like their responsibility as a journalist, they don't fulfill it anymore. But even if they say that these journalists don't care about like their moral, their imperative duty as like to present objective facts or present the whole facts, I think even then these Palestinian people, these Palestinian journalists exercise shit and of like social capital within Palestine as well. Why is that so? Because I think these people are largely respected primarily due to the fact that they're an active part of the Palestinian struggle. Primarily due to the fact that Palestinian people themselves associate with these people because they're on the front lines at the end of the day. I'll take OG.
From the perspective of the Palestinians in Gaza, the things that Hamas did is viewed as self-defense because Israelis continue to fuck up Palestinians, and the military power of Hamas is the reason.
I think this is the same narrative. I think this is the same propagation of narrative that whenever Hamas does something, you call it like self-defense. Whenever Israel does something, you call it an atrocity. I think within this comparative of self-defense and atrocity, the person that's screwed over most are Palestinian peoples. Because understand that when Hamas fires back at Israel itself, the collateral damage that occurs towards Palestinians is far more, which is why I think Hamas is a bad actor, primarily because every action that Hamas takes in name of self-defense is primarily screwing over Palestinians in the longer run. I think that's why we need to necessarily de-escalate the whole image that Hamas has created over it as like the savior of Palestinians itself. This is like Shaurya's whole extension of how primarily your image like within the domestic circles actually affected. I think secondly, I think Hamas bombs like Palestinian people too at the end of the day. This is like through collateral damage. This is through like storing dangerous weapons in like hospitals, organizations, and such things like that. I think this is why at the end of the day you actually do get screwed over in OG's Ivory House. But also I think the tacit support to Hamas by not highlighting their part would encourage them to perpetrate more violence, not only against Israel but also against people who support PLO and believe in non-violence. And I think secondly, media should never be a party to a conflict from any side, because if they do become one, there is basically no moral imperative left on which the right-wing media could be criticized at the end of the day. I think for these reasons, primarily the journalism and pro-Palestinian journalism, given the fact that Palestinians publish their own newspapers as well, you're not going to lose on social capital. Now, engaging with OG, I think OG hinders on this basic assumption that for any solution to exist, Hamas has to be on the upfront. I think this doesn't necessarily stand true for two basic reasons. I think given the fact that you don't give ISIS that level of power within like Middle East, given the fact you don't allow Al-Qaeda or you don't allow Taliban to like rule over Afghanistan at the end of the day, because you all agree that they're Islamicized actors. I think on this, what image do you want Palestinians to represent? Is it A, Islamicized right-wingers that bomb people and bomb their own people, or B, actual victims that at the end of the day are far more likely to be screwed over by this? I think on this comparative, we're far better than OG, primarily due to the fact that we actually get some level of solution, we get some level of empathy, we get some level of change, or we get some level of dynamic political change within Palestine itself. Now, lastly, why do we win over our opening? I think our opening hinders on this one way. For all those reasons, vote for CEO. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Opposition Whip, for that speech, and thank you everyone for that debate. Stop.